I can still picture the moment everything fell apart like it happened just yesterday. It was the night of our third wedding anniversary, a night that was supposed to be about joy, connection, and love. In the weeks leading up to it, Charlotte had been unusually attentive, almost as if she were trying to patch up the cracks that had been growing between us for months. She told me she wanted to plan the celebration herself, claiming it was her way of bringing us closer together. For a fleeting moment, I actually let myself believe her. I dared to hope that we might rediscover what we had lost. The evening started off on the right note. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses as friends and family gathered to celebrate with us. Even Charlotte's parents, who never really hid their disapproval of me, were surprisingly polite for once. Charlotte looked absolutely radiant in her dress, floating around the room with a bright smile as she chatted with the guests. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we were finding our way back to each other. And then he arrived, Nathan, her boss. I had never met him before, but the way her entire face lit up the moment he stepped through the door made my stomach drop. Without a second thought, she left my side to greet him, wrapping him in a hug that seemed far too warm and familiar. It felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a friendly, professional thing, nothing more. But as the night unfolded, it became harder to ignore. Over and over, I saw her gravitate toward him, laughing just a little too hard at his jokes, standing just a little too close. No matter where I turned, there they were, caught up in their own private bubble. It was like I'd been reduced to a spectator at my own anniversary party. Then came the speech. Charlotte tapped her glass to get everyone's attention, her smile beaming as if this was the happiest night of her life. She began by thanking everyone for coming and reminiscing about the highlights of our marriage. At first, it felt genuine, even heartfelt. I found myself smiling, thinking she might say something meaningful about our journey together. But then her tone shifted. Out of nowhere, she brought up how much she wanted to have children and how I had resisted the idea. My chest tightened as I realized she was airing out our private struggles for everyone to hear. She painted a picture of me as the selfish husband who prioritized his career and independence over her dreams. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, judgmental, probing, and condemning. I tried to speak up, to stop her from going further, but she brushed me aside like I wasn't even there. Her words grew sharper, cutting deeper with every sentence as she detailed how our constant arguments had drained her emotionally. And then, she dropped the bombshell. She started talking about Nathan, how he had been a source of comfort and understanding during the times she felt I wasn't. Her exact words, words I'll never forget, were, "Nathan understands me in ways I never thought possible." I froze. My brain couldn't keep up with what my ears were hearing. The room fell silent, except for her voice, as she kept going. She talked about feeling neglected and unappreciated, but all I could focus on was the part where she praised another man in front of me, in front of everyone. Our friends, our family, every single person who mattered to us, sat there, absorbing her words, while I stood there in stunned silence. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Humiliation, betrayal, anger, they all hit me at once, and yet I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could barely even breathe. The room was heavy with unspoken judgment, but no one said a word. They just looked at me, waiting for a reaction I didn't have the strength to give. My silence only seemed to reinforce her story. She wrapped up her speech with the cruelest blow of all. She raised her glass, her voice bright and steady, and declared that she had spent enough time fighting for a relationship that no longer served her. She toasted, to what, I'm not even sure, before turning back to the crowd, as if this was just another highlight in her life to celebrate. I stood there, frozen, staring at her. My mind was a swirling mess, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to tell the truth about who we were and what we'd been through. But no words came. My body wouldn't move, and my voice wouldn't rise. I was paralyzed under the crushing weight of humiliation and betrayal. That moment shifted everything, not just between Charlotte and me, but something deep inside me as well. Standing there in that suffocating silence, I realized nothing in my life would ever be the same again. To truly grasp what went wrong between us, you need to understand her family. From the very beginning, they were always there, an ever-present shadow in the background, silently scrutinizing every move I made. Her parents, both accomplished doctors, existed in a world of affluence and privilege I could never hope to match. Her brothers followed suit, one was a successful attorney, the other an ambitious entrepreneur. Charlotte had been raised in an environment where success wasn't just expected, it was mandatory. When we first started dating, I told myself I wouldn't let their opinions bother me. Charlotte warned me early on about their elitist tendencies, urging me not to take it personally if they seemed distant or dismissive. At first, their judgment showed in small, subtle ways, polite but cold smiles, comments that sounded complimentary but carried a sharp edge, like praising my work ethic while implying I'd needed to keep up with their lifestyle. I let it roll off my back, thinking I just needed to earn their approval. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. They made it abundantly clear, through whispered remarks and blatant comments, that I wasn't the kind of man they envisioned for Charlotte. I didn't belong in their world. My upbringing had been starkly different, a single mom working tirelessly to make ends meet and teach me the value of hard work and long-term goals. What I saw as strength and resilience, they viewed as a limitation, a sign that I couldn't measure up. This divide became even more apparent when the topic of children came up. For her parents, the solution was simple: we were married, so naturally, we should be starting a family. They were relentless in their hints and outright suggestions about the right time to have kids. Every visit with them felt less like a family gathering and more like an interrogation. When are we going to hear the pitter-patter of little feet? Charlotte's not getting any younger, you know. Don't worry about a thing, we'll help with everything. Charlotte didn't hesitate to side with them. She started echoing their sentiments, telling me they were right and that we could rely on her parents' support if we needed to. That was the core of the issue for me, though. I didn't want their help. I wanted to build something solid and secure for us, on my own terms. Accepting their financial support felt like surrendering any independence we had left, like giving them even more power over our lives. I just couldn't do it. To me, their offers weren't acts of generosity, they were subtle jabs, reminders of everything I supposedly lacked. It felt like a spotlight shining on my inadequacies, a way to show me that I would never be enough for their daughter. Charlotte, on the other hand, couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, see it that way. She thought I was being stubborn, too prideful to accept their help. But from where I stood, she was dismissing my feelings entirely. The more we argued about it, the more isolated I felt. She started calling me selfish, saying I didn't care about her dream of being a mother. But how could I explain that it wasn't the idea of having a child that scared me? It was the principle of it all, the idea that we'd forever be indebted to her parents, trapped under their roof of expectations. Her parents only made things worse. They never let an opportunity slip to remind me of what they could offer that I couldn't. Once, her mother even looked me straight in the eye and said, "Charlotte deserves a partner who can meet her needs without hesitation." Her father didn't miss a beat before adding, "Men in our family always rise to the occasion." Those words stung, but I bit my tongue. I didn't want to cause more friction, to escalate an already tense situation. Still, the constant barrage of subtle and not so subtle digs wore me down over time. Every dinner with her family felt like walking into a battlefield where I had to justify every choice I made, my career, my financial goals, even my worth as a husband. And Charlotte? She either didn't notice or didn't care. She laughed along with their comments, brushing off their remarks as harmless jokes. When I tried to talk to her about how it made me feel, she'd dismiss me, telling me I was overreacting or being too sensitive. What cut the deepest was the glaring double standard. From the moment Charlotte stepped into my life, I went out of my way to welcome her into my family. Sure, we weren't wealthy, and no one had fancy titles, but that didn't matter to us. My mom treated her like the daughter she never had, and my brothers adored her. Yet with her family, it was always different. I was the outsider, the one who had to prove himself worthy but could never quite measure up. This tension became a constant presence in our marriage, like a wedge slowly driving us further apart. The pressure to have children, to live up to their expectations, to somehow earn their approval, it all weighed heavily on me. Looking back, I can see how this dynamic set the stage for everything that followed. It wasn't just about me and Charlotte anymore. It was about her family's impossible standards and the fact that she never once stood up to them on our behalf. The cracks in our marriage weren't sudden. They didn't appear overnight, as though everything had been perfect one day and broken the next. In hindsight, it's easy to see how the small issues piled up over time, creating bigger problems that we both ignored. We became masters of avoidance, patching things up after arguments, sweeping unresolved issues under the rug, and pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Not even close. One of the early warning signs was how differently we handled stress. Charlotte and I had completely opposite approaches to conflict. I liked to take a step back, think things through, and tackle problems with a level head. Charlotte, on the other hand, was impulsive and emotional, often reacting in the heat of the moment before we even had a chance to figure out what was really wrong. It felt like we were speaking entirely different languages every time we tried to work through something important. Take our arguments about her family, for instance. I saw them as elitist and dismissive of me, and I told her exactly that. Instead of trying to see things from my perspective, she would accuse me of being too sensitive or even paranoid. She insisted her parents meant well and that I was misreading their intentions. When I pointed out blatant disrespect, like the time her mother said I was lucky to have married Charlotte, she would laugh it off or dismiss it altogether. That's just how they are, she'd say, as though that made it acceptable. It wasn't just her family, though. Charlotte and I clashed on some fundamental values. She came from a world where money and status smoothed over every bump in the road, where problems were solved with a checkbook. I grew up watching my mom stretch every dollar, learning to value hard work and independence. I wanted to build something solid for us, something we could call our own, without relying on anyone else, least of all her parents. But Charlotte couldn't wrap her head around that. To her, my refusal to accept their financial help was nothing but stubbornness. She accused me of letting my pride get in the way of our marriage, of being selfish and unwilling to compromise. I tried, time and time again, to explain that it wasn't about pride. It was about dignity, about feeling like an equal partner in our relationship. But no matter how I phrased it, she never seemed to truly hear me. Our differences weren't limited to finances and family. Even in the day-to-day rhythms of life, we were out of sync. I cherished quiet evenings at home, cooking dinner together, curling up on the couch to watch a movie, or just enjoying each other's company. Charlotte thrived on constant social interaction. She loved hosting parties, going out, and being the center of attention. What had felt exciting and dynamic when we were dating became a point of contention after we got married. She grew frustrated when I didn't want to go out every weekend, and I found myself drained by her endless need for social stimulation. And then there were the fights about children. It wasn't that I didn't want to have kids, I did, eventually, but I believed we needed to wait until we were in a better position, both financially and emotionally. To me, it seemed only logical to build a strong foundation before bringing a child into the picture. Charlotte, however, saw my hesitation as another example of me holding her back, of putting my priorities above hers. She'd say things like, "If you really loved me, you'd understand how much this means to me." Those words stung, because I did love her. But I also knew deep down that rushing into parenthood wouldn't fix what was already broken between us. It would only magnify our problems. Over time, the unresolved issues between us turned into a toxic cycle. We'd argue, make up, and then argue again, always over the same things. Each fight seemed worse than the last, with sharper words and deeper wounds. Charlotte started accusing me of being emotionally detached or selfish, hurling accusations that cut straight to the bone. I, on the other hand, began shutting down, retreating into myself to avoid saying something I couldn't take back. I thought keeping my distance during arguments would help keep the peace. Instead, it only made things worse. She took my silence as proof that I didn't care, while I saw her relentless need to confront me as completely draining. Despite all of this, I kept holding on. I told myself that every marriage had its rough patches, that we just needed to try harder. But the truth was, I was the only one trying. I swallowed my pride, made compromises, and bent over backward to be the husband she wanted. But Charlotte? She never met me halfway. It was her way or nothing at all. By the time that anniversary party rolled around, our marriage was already hanging by a thread. We were two people living under the same roof, but we weren't truly partners anymore. The love I felt for her still existed, but it was buried beneath layers of frustration, resentment, and sheer exhaustion. In hindsight, I think I knew it was over long before she made that speech. But admitting it, finally letting go of the hope that we could fix things, was something I just couldn't bring myself to do. Not yet. The silence that followed Charlotte's speech was suffocating. I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on me, each one silently asking the same question, "What are you going to do?" But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen, trying to process the betrayal that had just unfolded in front of everyone I cared about. It wasn't just humiliation, it was the kind of gut-wrenching betrayal that leaves you hollow, unsure whether to lash out or retreat completely. For a moment, it felt like I was completely alone in that room. But then, something I never expected happened. Her father, the same man who had spent years looking down his nose at me, stood up. At first, I thought he might try to defuse the situation with some half-hearted excuse, a shallow attempt to save face. But instead, he turned to Charlotte, and the look in his eyes was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was pure, unfiltered anger. "This is disgusting, Charlotte," he said, his voice sharp and dripping with disdain. "What on earth were you thinking, doing this here, in front of everyone?" The room, already eerily quiet, somehow grew even stiller. No one moved a muscle. Her mother sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed tightly together in what I can only describe as embarrassment. And Charlotte, who had been so self-assured and bold just moments ago, suddenly looked completely shaken. She stammered something about needing to be honest, but her father immediately cut her off. "Honest?" he barked, his voice rising. "This isn't honesty. This is selfish, cruel, and completely unacceptable. I can't believe I raised someone capable of this." I didn't know what shocked me more, his words or the sheer venom in his voice. This was the same man who had spent years undermining me, always reminding me in subtle ways that I wasn't good enough for his daughter. And yet, here he was, standing up for me, or at least standing firmly against her. Her father's anger erupted, shattering the perfect image of their family for the first time. His disgust with what Charlotte had done was unmistakable, but it wasn't aimed solely at her. It was as if he was furious with himself, too, for allowing things to reach such a breaking point. Her mother, who was usually composed and controlled, quietly followed him out of the room. She didn't say a word, her face pale and distant, as though the weight of the moment had robbed her of the ability to react. Charlotte's brothers, who had been standing in stunned silence, exchanged uneasy glances before one of them, Adam, finally broke the tension. "This isn't okay, Charlotte," he said, his voice steady but heavy with disappointment. "You need to own up to what you've done." The weight of their disapproval hit Charlotte like a tidal wave. Her eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for an ally, for anyone who might step in and defend her. But there was no one. Even her closest friends avoided her gaze, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and disbelief. And then, one by one, people began to leave. The room, once buzzing with laughter and celebration, became a void of awkwardness and judgment. Drinks were left half-finished, plates abandoned mid-meal, as though everyone collectively decided they couldn't bear to stay and witness what was unfolding. Within minutes, the place was nearly deserted, leaving behind an eerie silence. And still, I hadn't moved. I stood there, rooted in place, watching as the carefully planned celebration unraveled completely. The spotlight Charlotte had so confidently stepped into had transformed into something else, a relentless glare, exposing everything she tried to hide. What struck me most was how utterly unprepared she seemed for this outcome. For all her planning and bravado, it was clear she hadn't considered that her actions might blow up in her face. As the last few guests trickled out, the sting of her parents' harsh words lingered in the air. Charlotte stood frozen in the center of the room, her earlier confidence stripped away, replaced by something closer to panic. For the first time that night, she turned to look at me, not with the coldness or defiance I'd grown used to, but with an almost pleading desperation. I wanted to feel some sense of satisfaction, to relish the fact that her plan had backfired so spectacularly. But I didn't. Instead, I just felt hollow. Watching her fall apart didn't ease the humiliation she'd put me through or undo the pain she'd caused. The damage was done, and no amount of regret or shame on her part could undo what had already been shattered. Finally, I found my voice. "Pack your things," I said, my tone cold and flat, stripped of any emotion. "I want you out of the house tonight." Her eyes widened as if she couldn't comprehend what I'd just said. "Wait, can we talk about this?" she stammered, her voice trembling. But I shook my head, unmoved. "There's nothing left to talk about," I replied firmly. "You made your choice tonight, Charlotte. Now you'll have to live with it." Nathan, who had remained silent throughout the chaos, stepped forward awkwardly to help her. The sight of him putting a hand on her back, of her turning to him for support, felt like a knife twisting deeper into a wound that I hadn't thought could hurt anymore. Without a word, I turned away, unable to bear the sight of them leaving together. When they were finally gone, the house felt cavernous and empty. My mom and my younger brother were the only ones who stayed behind, lingering as though they didn't know what else to do. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like the weight of a collapsing building. It wasn't just the betrayal or the humiliation, it was the finality of it all. That night, everything I thought I knew, about my marriage, about Charlotte, about myself, came crashing down. There was no going back. In the days following that catastrophic night, I was still struggling to process everything. The house felt emptier than ever, and while my mom stayed with me for a while to help me through the worst of it, the quiet moments were unbearable. It was a strange kind of silence, one that seemed to echo with everything left unsaid. I hadn't reached out to Charlotte, and I had no plans to. As far as I was concerned, that chapter of my life was closed. Or so I wanted to believe. 2 days after the party, my phone buzzed with a text from her. My first instinct was to ignore it. What could she possibly say to justify what she'd done? But curiosity, or maybe something deeper I didn't want to admit, got the better of me, and I opened it. Her message was long, rambling, and almost desperate. She claimed she'd made a terrible mistake, that she regretted everything, and that her actions weren't as malicious as they had seemed. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, to set things right. She even attached a screenshot of her resignation letter from work, as though quitting her job would erase what had happened. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. My phone was flooded with apologies, explanations, and promises of change. She told me she had ended things with Nathan and was staying at a friend's house. According to her, the speech at the party had been a misguided attempt to get my attention, a way to make me see how unhappy she'd been. She admitted it was wrong but insisted it wasn't done out of malice, just pain and frustration. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Her words felt empty, like she was desperately trying to salvage what was already broken. And even if she was telling the truth, even if her relationship with Nathan had been purely emotional, how could I trust her again? After what she'd done, after how easily she had humiliated me in front of everyone, I couldn't see a path forward. But she didn't give up. After days of silence from me, she took things a step further. One morning, she showed up at my house unannounced. I was getting ready to leave for work when the intercom buzzed. Seeing her standing there, disheveled and visibly anxious, brought back a wave of anger I thought I'd already buried. My first instinct was to tell her to leave, to never set foot on my property again. But she insisted she had every right to come inside, reminding me that she'd paid part of the rent for the month. Technically, she wasn't wrong. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and let her in. The second she stepped inside, the floodgates opened. She started crying, tears that were equal parts anger and desperation. Her words came tumbling out in a rush, her emotions boiling over. "How could you write those things to me?" she demanded, referring to the one message I'd sent her after the party. "You made me sound like a monster." I stood there, staring at her, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "Do you not realize what you did?" I shot back, my voice cold and steady. "You stood in front of everyone we know and made me look like I wasn't enough for you. You humiliated me, Charlotte. You broke everything." Her response was a cascade of excuses. She claimed she'd acted out of hurt, that my emotional distance over the past months had pushed her to the edge. She insisted her speech wasn't meant to destroy me but was a cry for help, a way to make me see how much she was suffering. "I wanted you to see how much I was hurting," she said, her voice trembling as if that justified her actions. I stayed silent, letting her pour it all out. But the more she talked, the clearer it became that nothing she said could undo the damage. She kept framing her betrayal as a reaction to my supposed failures, as if her actions were somehow my fault. Every excuse, every justification only solidified what I already knew: there was no saving us. "You keep talking about how much you were hurting, but have you ever stopped to think about me?" I asked, my voice rising with the weight of everything I had been holding in. "Do you have any idea what it felt like to stand there, in front of our friends and family, and hear you praise another man? To hear you say you'd invested enough time in our marriage, like it was some kind of failed experiment? You're acting like I'm the only one who made mistakes, but I was doing everything I could to keep us together while you were busy tearing us apart." Her face twisted with frustration, her desperation quickly morphing into defensiveness. "I resigned from my job for you," she shot back. "I've been trying to fix this, and all you've done is shut me out." I shook my head, my patience wearing thin. "This isn't about your job, Charlotte. It's about trust. You shattered it, and I don't know how to repair that. Honestly, I don't even know if I want to." Her frustration boiled over into anger. She accused me of giving up too easily, of not caring enough to fight for what we had. "You're going to regret this," she said through tears that streaked her face. "You'll realize you lost the best thing that ever happened to you." I didn't argue. I was too drained to keep fighting. Instead, I walked to the door, opened it, and told her it was time to leave. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, and just like that, it was over. Or at least, I hoped it was. It's been a few months since I filed for divorce, and to my surprise, the overwhelming feeling I have is relief. The process was faster than I expected, mostly because there were no lengthy battles over assets or alimony. Charlotte tried, at one point, to demand spousal support, claiming she'd sacrificed her career for the marriage. But when I reminded her that I was ready to reveal everything that happened at the anniversary party in court, she quickly backed down. I think the fear of further embarrassing herself and her family was enough to make her let it go. When the paperwork was finalized, it felt like I could finally breathe again. For the first time in years, my life felt like it belonged to me. The house, once suffocating with tension and unspoken resentment, became a place of peace. My mom stayed with me for a while to help me through the early days, but eventually, I told her I needed to face this new chapter on my own. She understood, leaving with the promise to visit often. In those months, work became my refuge. I threw myself into my job with a focus I hadn't felt in years. The long hours weren't just a way to stay busy, they were a way to rediscover myself outside of my marriage. Slowly, I began to find joy in the simple routines. Each small achievement reminded me of who I used to be, the person I'd lost somewhere along the way. And it paid off. Just last week, I received a promotion, a position I'd been eyeing for over a year but never thought I'd be ready for. That moment felt like validation, proof that after everything I'd been through, I was still capable of building something meaningful. As for Charlotte, I've heard bits and pieces through mutual friends. Apparently, she's living with her parents now, which doesn't surprise me. They were always her safety net, the place she ran to when things got tough. I also heard she's still unemployed, which probably means she's leaning on them for support more than ever. I wonder if they've fully forgiven her for what happened, or if they're simply tolerating her because she's their daughter. I'd like to say I feel sorry for her, but the truth is, I don't. I spent so much of our marriage bending over backward to meet her needs, sacrificing my own happiness to keep her satisfied. In the end, all I got in return was betrayal and humiliation. Now, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm reclaiming the pieces of myself I had given up for her. The biggest change, though, has been in how I see the future. In the weeks following the divorce, I couldn't picture what my life would look like without her. It wasn't because I missed her, it was more about the fact that so much of who I was had been tied to being her husband. But now, my perspective has shifted. I see possibilities stretching out before me, the freedom to make choices that are entirely my own. I've started reconnecting with old friends, diving back into hobbies I'd left behind, and even thinking about traveling, a luxury I never really had the opportunity to enjoy during my marriage. It feels strange, but in the best way possible, to imagine a future shaped solely by what I want, without the constant weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. That's not to say the past doesn't creep in now and then. There are moments when I find myself reflecting on the good times we shared, wondering where things went so wrong. But those thoughts are fleeting. More often than not, I feel a deep sense of gratitude that it ended when it did. As painful as the experience was, it forced me to confront the truth about our relationship and make a choice I probably should have made long before that anniversary party. The irony is, during one of Charlotte's many attempts to win me back, she told me I'd regret leaving her. She was so sure I'd look back someday and realize I'd let go of the best thing in my life. But standing here now, I can't think of a single part of me that wants to return to that version of my life. The man I was in that marriage isn't the man I am now. And for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That doesn't mean I've got it all figured out. I know there will be challenges ahead, and I'm sure there will be days when doubt sneaks in and I question the path I've chosen. But for now, my focus is on moving forward, on building a life that reflects my choices, my values, and my happiness. And that, to me, feels like the beginning of something truly worth looking forward to.